Second inning, The Red-Legged Devil, Northern Virginia, 1864. I reckon that's the best baseball in Spotsylvania, Virginia, Stewart said. I reckon this is the only baseball in Spotsylvania, Virginia, Lewis Snyder said. He flipped his father's baseball high in the air and dashed forward to catch it. Lewis, will you stop? We could be set upon by Rebs any second. Stewart's skittishness was understandable, if a little tiresome. Lewis had been there for Stewart's rookie engagement in the Civil War, what the careermen called seeing the elephant, and had seen Stewart come away the worse for it. After their first battle, most men went one way or the other. They either got crazy or they got scared. Stewart got scared. He'd been a jumble of nerves ever since, and the whole time they'd been on patrol today, he jumped and twitched at every little sound. Lewis sighed and stowed the baseball away in his haversack, extracting a copy of Beatles' Baseball Player to look at as the two walked their patrol. Where on earth did you find that? My pa sent it to me. He's a top-rail player, only he could never go pro because of his legs. Got messed up in an explosion. In the war? Stewart asked. No, fighting a fire when he was a kid. That's why I joined the army, because he couldn't. Stewart peered at Lewis. Just how old are you, anyway? 16, Lewis lied. Say, it says here the National Association voted the fly rule in. No more catching a ball on the bounce. Uh-huh. What? I'm serious, Lewis said, but he knew Stewart was still on about his age. Stewart stopped and tensed, gripping his rifle in both hands. Lewis looked ahead and saw a little general store at a crossroads. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney pipe. Say, you don't suppose it's open, do you? Lewis asked. You're not thinking of going in there. Lewis, we're deep into Virginia. What if the owner is a Confederate? Lewis grinned. I'm counting on it. Follow my lead. Lewis bounded up the steps into the store, but froze inside the door. To his amazement, it was stocked like a Brooklyn Heights grocer's. There were barrels of fresh apples, carrots, and pecans, hunks of salt pork, sacks of flour and cornmeal and potatoes, shelves of fresh bread, rows of eggs. For a moment, he and Stewart stood in the doorway drooling. It was all Lewis could do to keep from lunging for the first scrumptious morsel in sight and not cease eating until he was arrested or shot, whichever came first. The shopkeeper came out from a small pantry in the back and stopped short when he saw them. Lewis and Stewart weren't wearing Union blues, but they weren't wearing Confederate grays either. The shopkeeper's hand disappeared beneath the counter and came back with a pistol, which he laid down beside the register. I'll have no trouble now, you hear, he told the boys. Lewis stepped forward with his hands in the air. And we don't aim to cause any. The shopkeeper nodded at them. What kind of costume is that anyway? French? Hessian? We're the Brooklyn 14th, Lewis told him. We're with the Army of the Potomac. Beside him, Lewis could hear Stewart hiss. The grocer picked up his gun again. This ain't a commissary neither, Union nor otherwise. You either got money or you don't, and I charge double for Yankees. That told Lewis all he needed to know. Heedless of the shopkeeper's gun, he strolled through the aisles, surveying the goods like he was shopping. Lewis, let's get out of here, Stewart whispered for all to hear. Lewis ignored him and spoke to the grocer. Oh, I've got a bit of money, he said, but I'm afraid it's just this worthless Confederate stuff. He pulled a few small bills out of his pocket and set them on the counter. I understand it's not good for much anything, like everything else down here. The shopkeeper raised himself up, insulted. So long as the Confederacy still stands, boy, those notes will be good in my store. Is that so? Lewis asked. He took off his haversack and withdrew 2 handfuls of bills, almost $500 in Confederate money, and put them on the counter. In that case, Lewis told him, we'll take everything you've got. They didn't really buy everything, of course, just as much as they could carry, but that was plenty enough for a first-rate feast. And when they returned, Lewis and Stewart were hailed by their fellow soldiers as heroes to the nation. It was all Lewis, Stewart told them, regaling the rest of the Brooklyn 14th with the story as he lazed by the fire, licking the chicken grease off his fingers. "Lucky Lewis," one of the boys said with a laugh. "Lucky nothing. Where'd you come by so many Confederate bills?" asked Corporal Bruner. "Well, I'll tell you," Lewis said. "Every night after a fight, I wait till late and sneak back onto the field of battle and go through the Rebs' coats." "You can't be serious." "Why not? They do it to themselves, so there's hardly a thing left anyway, except all that no-account cash. I was just collecting it to take home as souvenirs. I never figured on buying anything with it. Never thought I'd have the chance." "Lucky Lewis," somebody said again. Not lucky enough to earn a promotion, thought Lewis, although he'd certainly put in his time. He'd lied about his age 3 years ago, so he could march to Washington in '61 with the 14th and beg to go to war. They let him march, but perhaps suspecting he was underage, they only made him a drummer. Lewis had taken over as a standard bearer when Johnson took a bullet to the head in Antietam, and then had a rifle thrust in his hand at Fredericksburg. He'd battled the Graybacks at Chancellorsville, spent 3 days dodging bullets at Gettysburg, fought in the Battle of the Wilderness, and been in half again as many skirmishes in between. Maybe he was lucky after all. Of the 1,100 boys and men who'd left Brooklyn to the cheers of their city, only 143 remained. The rest, like Stuart, were fresh fish from home. Lewis took out the baseball again and flipped it between his hands. He wasn't lucky, he thought. It was the ball. His father had given it to him the day he left for the war, telling him to bring it back in one piece. Lewis figured his father wouldn't have let that ball go without knowing he'd get it back, which meant as long as he had it, he couldn't help but come home safe and sound. He ran a thumb over the S scratched in the leather, the S for Schneider. A sergeant who'd been with them from the first clapped a hand on Lewis's shoulder. "Have a game with that ball of yours?" he asked. "Could do," Lewis told him, "if I can ever get up off this spot again." The sergeant laughed. "Let us know. There's a lad from the 10th Massachusetts who's challenged us to a match." "I'm happy to beat the Bean Eaters any old time they wish," Lewis told him, "but only if they'll play by New York rules. I'd rather the game not last 3 days. Soldiers suddenly began scrambling for their caps and coats. Stuart leaped to his feet and knocked over the kettle before falling to the ground himself. "What is it?" he asked. "Are we under attack?" Lewis stood up. "General Cumming!" a sergeant yelled, running through the camp. "Make ready to present General Cumming!" Lewis buttoned up his uniform and helped Stuart to his feet. They scurried to attention under the watchful eye of Lieutenant Tinker as a horse's hoofbeats drew closer. "Attention!" Tinker cried, and the 14th stood straight. The man who rode up was known to Lewis and the others who had been with the regiment the longest. He was General Abner Doubleday, the man who had commanded the Brooklyn 14th at Antietam and again at Gettysburg. He was a stout man, as most generals were, with a hulking brown mustache, long, tall nose, and receding line of dark curly hair. Lewis counted him brave, if not brilliant, for his actions on the battlefield, though none of the boys thought the worse of him. Doubleday pulled his mount to a stop before them and surveyed their lines. "The Brooklyn 14th, he said. "The red-legged devils." They had gotten the nickname after Bull Run, where it was said they had fought with hell's fury. General McDowell even let them keep their red breeches and hats as badges of honor when the rest of the army was issued standard blues. The 14th's uniform, like their boys, were supplied by the city of Brooklyn herself. Doubleday rode up and down the lines inspecting them, then stopped to speak. "On many a weary march and many a hard-fought field, I have personally seen your courage and devotion. Your name is a household word in the Army. You are the elite of our division." Lewis stood a little straighter. "You original members who mustered in during the formation of your regiment, you who have survived Bull Run, South Mountain, Falmouth, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Rappahannock Station, Chancellorsville, Sulphur Springs, Gettysburg, Groveton, the Wilderness, Gainesville, and Spotsylvania Courthouse twice. You brave few who remain have earned your nation's respect and gratitude. You have also earned your release from the Army of the Potomac." Lucky again! Lewis looked at those in Company K who had been around from the beginning. 1 or 2 of them were crying, but whether they were tears of joy or sorrow, Lewis didn't know. For his part, It was as though a great weight had lifted off his shoulders. His father's baseball had seen him through. Tomorrow morning you will take a train to Baltimore, and thence to Jersey City and home to Brooklyn, where your city fathers are even now, I am told, making ready a celebration of some consequence. The general sniffed the air and moved his horse closer to one of the campfires. Although I gather you've already had something of a celebration here today. A ripple of laughter rode through the company. I do swear, I have never known a regiment so full of shrewd devices to avoid unnecessary hardships as the Brooklyn 14th. Where in tarnation did you... Nope, I had better not know. If you'd care to have a game with us, called Corporal Ruggy, we plan to play baseball next. The general laughed. I have no talent or interest for baseball, said Doubleday, but I would very much like to sample whatever is brewing in that pot over yonder. Company dismissed, cried Lieutenant Tinker. The soldiers relaxed and fell out of ranks, and the general worked his way back to the homemade still, congratulating those who would be sent home. Stewart hugged his friend. You've made it, Lewis. Lucky Lewis. You're headed home for Brooklyn. Perhaps I'll be home in time to see the Atlantics play the Eckfords for the championship, if the Putnams don't win it. Have you heard? They've put up a fence around the Union grounds and are charging 10 cents admission to see their games. Stewart shook his head. Paying admission will be the ruin of baseball. What's next? Paying the players? Lewis smiled. For once, Stewart wasn't listening for the snap of twigs and the report of rifles. Come on, Lewis told him. Let's go have a game. And we won't charge the trees and rocks any admission to watch. They had more than enough to play among their own company, and the officers set to choosing up sides. The 14th had a serviceable piece of oak they used for a bat, and the bases were measured off according to the New York rules. The fly rule was agreed upon, as most players thought catching the ball in the fly was more manly anyway. But stealing bases, a new practice introduced by Ned Cuthbert of the Philadelphia Keystones, was deemed unsportsmanlike and prohibited. General Doubleday was solicited to call balls and strikes, but he had other companies to see, and so the team made do with Lieutenant Tinker. That day, Lewis heard it said that a more delightful afternoon of baseball was never had in Virginia, nor, it was argued, at any time in Manhattan or Long Island. He had to agree. Corporal Bruner pitched as well as James Creighton of the Brooklyn Excelsiors, and Stewart drew applause for a fine diving catch made on a fly to the outfield. On Lewis's third time at bat, there were red-legged devils standing on first and second base with the score tied at 6 aces apiece. Lewis was eager to have another go at Bruner's dastardly dewdrops, the balls that seemed to float across the plate as leaves descend to the forest floor, and his mates cheered him on from the sidelines. Bruner lofted the ball, and Lewis waited, and then swung, striking the ball high in the air towards Stewart in center field. Lewis watched him trail back on it as he ran. Then, surprisingly, Stewart broke off his pursuit of the ball and turned to stare at the edge of the woods. Wait, I think there's somebody, he started to call off, but he never finished. The pop of a rifle and the telltale puff of blue-gray smoke came out of the woods, and Stewart's leg exploded. In a moment, the air was full of bumblebees, whizzing lead balls that cracked into the trees and the dirt. Lewis's run toward third became a sprint for his life. The shots brought men in their long johns scurrying from the Union camps with rifles in hand, and while those playing the game looked for holes to crawl into, the rest of the red-legged devils came charging into the clearing to meet the Confederates in the forest. What started as a skirmish turned into a full-scale battle, giving Lewis and the other ball players time enough to go back for their rifles and rejoin the fight. The Brooklyn 14th drove the rebels into the forest again, and then the Confederates, receiving reinforcements, pushed the Union soldiers back to their camp. When dusk fell, there was no clear winner, as was so often the case in engagements like this, and Lieutenant Tinker received orders to break camp and retreat. Lewis marched with his company 2 miles inland under cover of night, and they set up their tents by a small stream. The camp canard had the rest of the regiment moving on to North Anna, some 2 days away, while Lewis and the rest who had received their release would be transported to the nearest railway station when it was safe, and then ferried northward and homeward. But Lewis couldn't go back to Brooklyn. Not yet. He had, alas, lost 2 things on the field of battle he could not leave behind: his friend, Palmer Stewart, and the best and only baseball in Spotsylvania, Virginia.